A chocolate river that shouldn't exist, a boy who walks into a world that feels like a dream but behaves like a trap, and a man who believes magic is real even when the world keeps telling him it isn't. Wonka 2023 is not just a film about chocolate, it is a story about ambition, loneliness, and the price of imagination in a world that prefers rules over wonder. This movie feels like a warm memory you never actually lived, like someone telling you a bedtime story that somehow smells like sugar, rain, and hope at the same time. At its heart, it asks a simple question: what does it take to turn impossible dreams into something people can actually taste? Now let's go deep into the full journey of the film in a detailed breakdown, covering everything from casting and development to production, music, release, reception, box office, analysis, and even the memes and internet culture it created. The idea of Wonka began as an attempt to explore the early life of Willy Wonka, the legendary chocolatier first created by Roald Dahl. Instead of remaking Charlie and the Chocolate Factory again, the filmmakers wanted to go backwards in time, before the factory, before the golden ticket, before the eccentric genius became a mystery. They wanted to show the dreamer before the dream was fully formed. Paul King, the director known for his work on the Caddington films, became the creative force behind the movie. His style is soft, emotional, and deeply whimsical, which made him a natural fit for a story like this. Instead of focusing on darkness or cynicism, he leaned fully into innocence and wonder, almost like he was making a musical fairy tale for modern audiences who have forgotten how to believe in magic. Casting became one of the most important parts of the film because Willy Wonka is not an easy character to play. He is strange but charming, funny but lonely, confident but insecure. The role finally went to Timothée Chalamet, a choice that surprised some people at first but slowly made sense as more footage and trailers were released. Chalamet brought a delicate balance to Wonka. He wasn't trying to imitate previous versions like Gene Wilder or Johnny Depp. Instead, he created a younger version of the character who still believes the world can be changed with creativity and kindness. Alongside him, the film built a strong supporting cast. Hugh Grant appeared in a memorable role as an Oompa Loompa, bringing sarcasm and comic timing in a way that became one of the most talked about elements of the movie. Olivia Colman played a key antagonist figure in the form of a cruel and greedy laundress who represents how ordinary people can crush extraordinary dreams. Sally Hawkins played Wonka's mother, adding emotional depth and explaining where his imagination and emotional sensitivity come from. Other supporting roles included Keegan Michael Key as a corrupt official, Rowan Atkinson as a priest with a love for chocolate, and Jim Carter as a hotel manager who becomes part of Wonka's early struggles. Each character represents a different part of society that either resists or misunderstands creativity. The development of the film took years and it went through different ideas before reaching its final form. At one point, it was meant to be a darker origin story, but over time, it evolved into a more musical, uplifting experience. The goal was to make something that felt like a classic family film but still modern in emotional tone. Production design became one of the strongest aspects of the movie. The world of Wonka is built like a slightly exaggerated version of 19th century Europe, where everything feels real but slightly more colorful than reality. The chocolate shop streets, the laundromat empire, and the underground factory systems all feel handcrafted, almost like miniature sets brought to life. Filming focused heavily on practical sets rather than pure digital environments. This choice gave the movie a tangible texture. You can almost feel the wood, the steam, the sugar dust in the air. The cinematography uses warm colors, browns, golds, reds, and soft blues to create a comforting but slightly surreal atmosphere. It is not realism, it is emotional realism. The musical element of the film is another major layer. Unlike many modern musicals that feel forced, Wonka integrates its songs into storytelling naturally. Neil Hannon of the Divine Comedy contributed to the songwriting, helping shape a musical tone that feels theatrical but not overwhelming. The songs are used to express Wonka's dreams, his frustrations, and his refusal to give up when the world keeps rejecting him. One of the central themes of the film is isolation. Wonka arrives in a city with nothing but hope and a few coins, and he immediately learns that the chocolate industry is controlled by powerful cartels who refuse to let an outsider succeed. This creates a strong underdog narrative where creativity battles against corruption. The laundromat villains, led by Olivia Colman's character, represent monopolistic control over sweetness itself. Chocolate is not just food in this world, it is power, status, and control. Wonka's crime is not making chocolate, it is making it freely and joyfully. As the story unfolds, Wonka forms friendships with other outsiders, including a small orphan girl named Noodle, who becomes both a companion and emotional anchor. Their relationship adds warmth to the story and highlights Wonka's role not just as a dreamer but also as someone learning responsibility. The humor in the film is gentle but constant. Hugh Grant's Oompa Loompa scenes especially became iconic because of their dry, almost cynical tone contrasting with Wonka's innocence. This contrast helps balance the movie so it never becomes overly sentimental. When the film was released, it arrived during the holiday season, which was perfect timing. Families were looking for something uplifting, and Wonka delivered exactly that. Critics responded with generally positive reviews, praising its charm, visual, and Timothée Chalamet's performance. Some critics felt it leaned too heavily into sweetness and avoided darker emotional complexity, but many appreciated that choice as part of its identity. At the box office, the film performed strongly worldwide. It attracted both family audiences and fans of musicals as well as viewers curious about the Wonka universe. Its international appeal was boosted by its visual storytelling, which works even without dialogue understanding in some scenes. Now, if we go deeper into analysis, Wonka is really a film about creative survival. It is about how artists, inventors, and dreamers are often exploited or blocked by systems that fear change. Wonka's chocolate is not just candy, it is imagination made edible. Every invention he creates represents a refusal to accept a dull world. The film also explores grief subtly through Wonka's memory of his mother. She represents belief in magic and kindness, and her absence pushes him to continue her philosophy. This emotional thread is what keeps the character grounded even when the story becomes fantastical. Online, the movie created a wave of memes, especially around Hugh Grant's Oompa Loompa performance. His deadpan expressions, small stature, CGI transformation, and sarcastic singing became viral moments. People also joked about Wonka being too pure for capitalism or starting a chocolate revolution. Social media edits turned scenes into emotional, aesthetic clips, often paired with nostalgic music, giving the film a second life beyond theaters. This is only the beginning of the full deep dive into Wonka. The film has much more to explore: scene breakdowns, deeper character psychology, hidden references to Roald Dahl's original work, and how it fits into modern Hollywood's trend of reimagining classic intellectual properties. Wonka slowly shifts from a bright dream of arrival into a harsher reality about survival systems and the cost of imagination. If the first part feels like a fairy tale beginning, this part feels like the moment the fairy tale gets tested by real life. The film begins properly with Willy Wonka arriving in a grand European style city with nothing but a small suitcase, a handful of cocoa beans, and a mind full of impossible ideas. He is immediately positioned as an outsider. The city itself feels structured, controlled, almost emotionally cold beneath its beauty. Every shop has rules, every success has a price, and every dream seems to already belong to someone else. Wonka's first major attempt to introduce himself to the world is through chocolate. He opens a tiny stall in a public square, believing that people will instantly recognize the beauty of what he has created. This is one of the most important emotional scenes in the film because it shows his pure optimism. He is not trying to conquer the market, he is trying to share joy. But reality responds differently. The city's powerful chocolate cartel, led by established chocolatiers, immediately sees him as a threat. These characters are not just businessmen, they represent systems that protect mediocrity because it is predictable. Wonka's chocolate is not just different, it is disruptive. It has emotional flavor and unusual effects and imaginative presentation. In other words, it cannot be controlled. His early failure is important because it introduces one of the film's main arcs: innocence versus structure. Wonka believes talent is enough. The world shows him that systems often matter more than talent. After his first setback, Wonka is forced into debt and manipulation. He is tricked into signing agreements he does not fully understand, which pushes him into working under exploitative conditions in a laundry business run by a powerful and ruthless woman played by Olivia Colman. This section of the film becomes much darker in tone. The laundry empire is not just a business, it is a metaphor for industrial control. Everything is washed, processed, and standardized. Nothing is allowed to stand out. This directly contrasts with Wonka's personality, which is chaotic, colorful, and unpredictable. Inside this environment, Wonka meets Noodle, a young orphan girl who has also been trapped by the system. She becomes one of the emotional centers of the film. Noodle is not just a side character, she represents the part of society that still believes change is possible but has been forced into survival mode instead of dreaming. Their relationship develops slowly. At first, there is mistrust. Noodle has learned not to believe in promises, especially from adults with big ideas. Wonka, on the other hand, is still learning that not everyone is inspired by optimism. But over time, they form a bond based on shared understanding of being outsiders. One of the key hidden meanings in their relationship is mentorship reversal. Usually, in stories like this, the adult teaches the child. Here, Noodle teaches Wonka something just as important: how to survive in a world that does not reward imagination. This makes their dynamic more balanced and emotionally grounded. As Wonka begins working in the laundry system, he secretly continues experimenting with chocolate recipes. These hidden experiments are symbolic. They represent creativity surviving in hostile environments. Even when surrounded by rules, Wonka's imagination refuses to stop functioning. This leads into one of the film's central conflict structures: the chocolate cartel versus underground creativity. The cartel's leaders begin actively sabotaging Wonka's attempts to build a legitimate business. They bribe officials, destroy his supplies, and manipulate public opinion. What makes this interesting is that the conflict is not physical, it is economic and psychological. Wonka starts to realize that success is not just about making something good. It is about navigating systems designed to prevent new ideas from succeeding. During this part of the film, Hugh Grant's Oompa Loompa character is introduced in a way that feels both comedic and mythic. He is initially positioned as a mysterious figure with his own agenda, almost like a myth inside Wonka's journey. His presence introduces a philosophical layer to the film. Even magical beings have histories shaped by exploitation and control. His scenes often break emotional tension with irony. While Wonka is serious about dreams and justice, the Oompa Loompa often responds with sarcasm, suggesting that he has already seen enough of the world to stop being impressed by idealism. One of the most important mid-film sequences is Wonka's attempt to break free from the laundry system. This is where the story shifts from passive struggle to active rebellion. With the help of Noodle and a small group of fellow workers, Wonka begins to expose corruption within the chocolate industry. Each step of his plan involves creative problem solving rather than violence. He uses chocolate inventions not just as products but as tools, items that reveal secrets, confuse enemies, and expose hidden truths. This reinforces the idea that creativity is a form of resistance. At the same time, emotional depth is added through flashbacks of Wonka's mother. These memories are not overly detailed but appear in fragments. Her voice, her encouragement, her belief that imagination is a form of kindness. These moments serve as Wonka's emotional fuel. Whenever he doubts himself, her memory returns, reminding him that his purpose is not just success but joy. A key turning point happens when Wonka realizes that he cannot win alone. His journey shifts from individual ambition to collective effort. This is where the film subtly changes its message. Early on, Wonka believes genius is enough. Later, he understands that even genius needs community. The sabotage from the chocolate cartel escalates into public manipulation. They try to destroy Wonka's reputation, framing him as irresponsible and dangerous. This is one of the more realistic elements of the story. It reflects how systems often attack credibility rather than ideas. Wonka's response is not revenge, but innovation. He creates a series of public chocolate demonstrations that reveal truth through spectacle. These scenes are visually rich, almost theatrical, and they function like emotional arguments rather than business promotions. Eventually, the conflict builds toward a confrontation where Wonka's ideas are tested not just by competitors but by public belief. The question becomes, will people trust something new if they have been trained to fear it? Noodle's arc also reaches a turning point here. She learns that she is not powerless. Her role shifts from victim to participant in change. This is important because the film avoids making Wonka the only savior. Instead, it builds a shared narrative of transformation. The hidden meaning of this entire section of the film is about institutional resistance to creativity. The chocolate cartel is not evil in a cartoon sense, they are practical, profit driven, and afraid of instability. This makes them more realistic and more relevant to modern audiences. By the end of this section, Wonka is no longer just a dreamer selling chocolate. He is becoming a symbol of resistance against systems that regulate imagination. If the first part of the film is about arrival and the second part is about struggle, then what follows next is transformation. The final phase of Wonka's journey begins to shape him into the legendary figure audiences already know from earlier adaptations. The final act of Wonka is where everything the film has been building finally turns into something bigger than just a personal story. It stops being about a boy trying to sell chocolate and becomes about a world deciding what kind of imagination it is willing to allow. By this point, Willy Wonka is no longer the same naive dreamer who arrived in the city with wide eyes and a suitcase full of cocoa beans. He has been tested by exploitation, betrayal, and systems designed to crush anyone who doesn't fit inside them. But instead of becoming bitter, he becomes sharper. His imagination doesn't disappear, it becomes strategic. The chocolate cartel, realizing they cannot simply ignore him anymore, escalate their efforts. They move from sabotage to full scale suppression. Their goal is no longer just to outcompete Wonka but to erase him from the market completely. This is where the film subtly shifts into a commentary on how industries sometimes treat innovation. Not as competition but as threat, Wonka, however, is no longer alone. His alliance with Noodle and the group of workers he freed from the laundry system becomes the emotional and tactical backbone of his resistance. What is important is that the final act doesn't turn him into a lone genius hero. Instead, it fully embraces the idea that creativity becomes powerful when shared. The plan Wonka develops is not about direct confrontation, it is about exposure. He designs a series of chocolate based inventions that do more than entertain, they reveal truth. Each invention is carefully designed to expose corruption, greed, and the hidden machinery behind the cartel's power. One of the most visually striking sequences involves Wonka presenting chocolate creations in a public setting where the cartel expects him to fail. Instead, his inventions begin reacting in unexpected ways, revealing hidden messages, triggering emotional responses in the crowd, and breaking the illusion of control the cartel has maintained for years. The audience doesn't just see chocolate, they experience truth disguised as wonder. This is one of the film's key ideas. Imagination as truth telling. Wonka's chocolate is not just fantasy, it is a tool that reveals what is hidden beneath systems of control. The cartel's response becomes increasingly desperate. They attempt to discredit him publicly, spreading fear that his creations are dangerous or unstable. But the public is no longer fully convinced by authority alone. This shift is subtle but important. The film suggests that systems of control only work as long as people believe in them without question. Meanwhile, Noodle's character reaches her emotional peak. She discovers more about her own past and how she was connected, directly or indirectly, to the same system that oppresses her. This revelation doesn't weaken her, it strengthens her resolve. She stops being just a companion and becomes an active force in dismantling the cartel's influence. There is also a quiet emotional thread running through the final act, Wonka's relationship with his mother's memory. Instead of being just nostalgia, it becomes guidance. Her belief that impossible things are just things you haven't understood yet becomes the philosophical foundation of his final actions. He is no longer chasing success, he is fulfilling a legacy of belief. One of the most symbolic moments in the final act is when Wonka begins transforming his small, chaotic experiments into something more structured. This is the origin energy of what will eventually become the famous chocolate factory. But in this film, it is still fragile. It is not a kingdom yet. It is a promise. The Oompa Loompa character played by Hugh Grant also reaches his narrative purpose here. Initially introduced as mysterious and cynical, he becomes more than comic relief. His presence represents lived experience. The idea that imagination alone is not enough without awareness of consequences. His journey mirrors Wonka's in reverse, where Wonka starts idealistic and becomes grounded. The Oompa Loompa starts cynical and slowly reconnects with possibility. The climax of the film is not a single battle but a collapse of illusion. The cartel's control begins to break as their methods are exposed. Their power was never truly physical, it was social, financial, and psychological. Once those layers are disrupted, their dominance begins to crumble. Wonka does not destroy them through force. Instead, he outcreates them. His inventions, his ideas, and his emotional connection to people become more influential than their systems of control. This is a key thematic conclusion. Imagination is stronger than authority when it connects with people directly. In the final emotional sequence, Wonka is finally recognized not just as a chocolate maker, but as something closer to a visionary. But interestingly, the film does not present this as full victory. It feels more like a beginning than an ending. The factory that fans know from later stories is still not fully formed. What exists instead is the foundation of something greater. Noodle's story also reaches closure in a way that avoids cliche. She is not simply saved by Wonka. She chooses her own direction, shaped by what she has learned about herself and the world. Her arc reinforces one of the film's most modern ideas. Liberation is not being rescued, but realizing you were never powerless to begin with. As the story settles, Wonka's identity solidifies. He is no longer just a boy with ideas, nor just a struggling entrepreneur. He becomes a symbol of controlled chaos, someone who believes that joy, imagination, and creativity are not luxuries but necessities. The final tone of the film is intentionally warm but slightly reflective. It doesn't end with loud celebration. Instead, it ends with the sense that something important has begun. The chocolate factory is not fully built yet, but the philosophy behind it has been established. A place where imagination is protected, not suppressed. The deeper meaning of the final act is about transformation of systems through imagination rather than destruction. The film suggests that real change does not always come from overthrowing structures violently, but from making them obsolete by offering something more meaningful. When we look at Wonka as a whole, the final act redefines everything that came before it. The early optimism, the middle struggle, and the final breakthrough all form a single idea. Creativity is not just about making things, it is about changing what people believe is possible. And that is where Willy Wonka truly becomes Willy Wonka. Not the eccentric chocolate maker of legend yet, but the beginning of a myth that is still in progress. This is the part where Wonka stops being just a charming origin story and starts looking like a layered emotional puzzle. Under all the chocolate rivers, musical numbers, and colorful chaos, the film quietly builds a psychological map of its characters while also hiding small references to Roald Dahl's world and feeding the internet with meme material that took on a life of its own. Willy Wonka's psychology is built around a single emotional contradiction. He deeply believes the world can be better, but he also keeps getting punished for believing it. This creates a personality that looks cheerful on the surface but is constantly processing disappointment underneath. He is not naive in a simple way, he is someone who chooses hope repeatedly, even after evidence suggests caution. His obsession with chocolate is not just creative passion, it functions like emotional language for him. Chocolate becomes a way to communicate feelings he cannot fully express in normal social systems. This is why his inventions often behave like emotions rather than food. Some make people laugh, some confuse them, some even reveal hidden truths. Psychologically, this reflects someone who externalizes emotion through creation instead of direct communication. There is also a subtle loneliness running through Wonka's character. Even when he is surrounded by people later in the film, he often feels slightly separate from them, like someone observing humanity rather than fully belonging to it. The memory of his mother becomes the anchor that keeps him connected to emotional warmth. Without her, Wonka would likely drift into pure obsession with invention. She is the emotional grounding force that prevents his imagination from becoming detached from humanity. Noodle, on the other hand, represents psychological adaptation to survival. Unlike Wonka, she does not believe the world is kind by default. She believes kindness is something you negotiate, not something you expect. This makes her cautious, observant, and emotionally guarded. Her journey in the film is about slowly unlearning the idea that she must always expect betrayal. Her relationship with Wonka is psychologically interesting because it is not built on dependency, it is built on mutual correction. Wonka teaches her to imagine beyond survival, while she teaches him to recognize limits and danger. Together, they form a balanced emotional system that neither could maintain alone. The antagonist system in the film, the chocolate cartel and the laundry empire, represents a very specific psychological structure control through predictability. These characters are not chaotic villains. They are structured, procedural, and emotionally detached. Their psychology is built on fear of disruption. Anything unpredictable like Wonka threatens their sense of control. Even Olivia Colman's character, while comedic in tone, embodies this idea of emotional flattening. She is not driven by passion but by management. Everything is reduced systems, profit, and order. In psychological terms, she represents the suppression of imagination in favor of control. Now, when we move into hidden role doll references, Wonka becomes much more playful. The film is full of subtle nods to Dahl's original books, not just Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, but his broader literary universe. The most obvious reference is, of course, the Oompa Loompa played by Hugh Grant. In Dahl's original stories, Oompa Loompas are strange, almost mythological workers with moral commentary roles. The film modernizes this by turning him into a sarcastic, self aware character who feels like he has already seen too many chosen one stories. His personality is almost meta commentary on storytelling itself. The chocolate inventions also echo Dahl's tendency to mix wonder with consequence. In his books, magical sweets often come with strange side effects. The film keeps this spirit alive, where chocolate is never just food, it is transformation. This reflects Dahl's core idea. Desire always comes with unexpected results. Noodle's orphan status is another quiet reference to Dahl's recurring theme of isolated children navigating unfair adult worlds. Many of his protagonists, like Matilda or James from James and the Giant Peach, start in positions of emotional neglect but grow through imagination and intelligence rather than brute strength. Even the tone of the city itself feels Dahl inspired. It is exaggerated but grounded, whimsical but slightly cruel underneath. This duality is very important in Dahl's writing. Childhood wonder always exists alongside adult systems that are indifferent or even hostile. Symbolism in Wonka is layered but surprisingly consistent. Chocolate itself is the central symbol, representing imagination made tangible. It is creativity you can taste, something abstract turned physical. Every time Wonka creates something new, it symbolizes a new emotional possibility being introduced into a rigid world. The laundromat system symbolizes emotional erasure. Washing, cleaning, and processing become metaphors for removing individuality. Everything that passes through it becomes uniform. This is the opposite of Wonka's philosophy, where individuality is the core ingredient. The city represents structured capitalism in its early industrial form, where creativity is allowed only if it can be controlled and monetized. Wonka's conflict with the system is not just business, it is philosophical resistance against emotional standardization. Now, moving into internet meme culture, Wonka became an unexpected online phenomenon, especially after Hugh Grant's Oompa Loompa performance was released in trailers and clips. The combination of serious CGI transformation with his deadpan expression created an instant meme template. People began editing his scenes into absurd contexts, turning him into a sarcastic commentator on everything from modern jobs to relationship advice. Timothée Chalamet's portrayal of Wonka also became a meme in a different way. His soft, dreamy expressions and musical numbers led to online jokes about him being too aesthetically emotional or living in a permanent Pinterest board. Some edits exaggerated the film's warm color palette to the point where it became a parody of itself. Another meme trend was the idea of Wonka capitalism, where users jokingly compared modern corporate systems to the chocolate cartel in the film. Posts are from Wonka as a kind of emotional revolutionary fighting against overly structured industries. While humorous, these interpretations actually echoed the film's underlying themes quite closely. Musical clips from the film also spread widely on short form video platforms. The upbeat numbers combined with whimsical visuals made the movie highly editable for nostalgic or aesthetic content. Some users even reframed scenes as comfort cinema, emphasizing its soft escapist tone. Interestingly, the memes helped extend the life of the film beyond its theatrical run. Even people who had not seen the full movie recognized Hugh Grant's Oompa Loompa or snippets of Wonka singing in crowded markets. In a way, the internet turned the film into a collection of emotional fragments rather than a single narrative. When all these layers come together, psychology, symbolism, hidden references, and meme culture, Wonka becomes more than just a prequel. It becomes a reflection of how modern audiences interact with stories. Some see it as emotional comfort, others as satire, and others as aesthetic inspiration. But at its core, the film remains simple. It is about a person who refuses to stop believing that imagination can still change the world, even when the world keeps insisting otherwise. By the time you reach a full critical reading of Wonka 2023, the film stops being just a colorful origin story and becomes something closer to a statement about how modern cinema reinterprets nostalgia. Critics and audiences didn't just respond to the movie itself, They responded to what it represents. A softer, more emotionally safe version of a character that has historically carried a darker, more chaotic edge. From a critical standpoint, one of the most discussed elements of the film is its tone. Director Paul King deliberately leans into warmth, optimism, and musical charm, creating a world that feels almost untouched by cynicism. Critics who appreciated the film often described it as comfort cinema, a throwback to old fashioned family musicals where emotion is direct and sincerity is not treated as irony. However, some critics argued that this softness comes at a cost. In avoiding darkness, the film occasionally reduces conflict into something too neatly resolved. The chocolate cartel, while symbolically interesting, is often viewed as structurally simple compared to more complex antagonistic systems seen in modern fantasy or musical films. This leads to a debate. Is Wonka intentionally simplified to preserve fairy tale purity, or does it avoid deeper moral complexity? Supporters of the film argue that simplicity is the point. Wonka himself is not a morally grey character in this interpretation. He is a symbol of imaginative persistence. The film is less interested in realism and more focused on emotional clarity. In that sense, it succeeds in creating a modern fairy tale that does not rely on darkness to feel meaningful. Timothée Chalamet's performance is one of the most positively received aspects in most reviews. Critics note that he avoids imitating previous versions of Willy Wonka, especially Gene Wilder's iconic eccentricity or Johnny Depp's surreal unpredictability. Instead, Chalamet plays Wonka as emotionally open, slightly awkward, and intensely idealistic. This version feels more human and less mythic, which aligns with the film's origin story structure. Audience interpretation, however, is more divided than critical reception. Many viewers embrace the film as a nostalgic, feel good musical experience, especially families and younger audiences who connected with its colorful aesthetic and straightforward emotional storytelling. For them, Wonka works as an accessible fantasy where creativity is always rewarded and imagination is safe. On the other hand, some longtime fans of Roald Dahl adaptations felt that the film modernized Wonka too much, stripping away some of the eccentric unpredictability that defined earlier versions. For them, Willy Wonka is supposed to feel slightly unsettling, someone whose genius borders on chaos. This interpretation sees Wonka 2023 as too emotionally grounded, almost too polite. This brings us to a key comparison. Willy Wonka across three major cinematic interpretations, Gene Wilder's Willy Wonka 1971 remains the most iconic version for many audiences. In Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, Wilder plays the character with a carefully balanced mix of warmth and unpredictability. His Wonka is playful but also slightly unsettling, as if you are never fully sure what he will do next. That ambiguity is what gives the character depth. He feels like someone who operates by his own internal logic, not by social rules. Johnny Depp's version in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory 2005 takes a very different approach. His Wonka is socially detached, awkward, and emotionally stunted. This interpretation leans into psychological backstory, suggesting trauma and isolation as the source of his eccentric behavior. The tone is darker, more surreal, and at times more uncomfortable. Burton's version emphasized emotional damage beneath creativity. Timothée Chalamet's Wonka 2023 sits somewhere between innocence and ambition. Instead of trauma or mystery, this version is built on hope. He is not emotionally broken or cryptic, he is still forming. This is the key difference. Wilder's Wonka is fully formed and unpredictable, depth is shaped by emotional isolation, and Chalamet is still becoming who he will eventually be. This structural difference explains why the tone of each film feels so distinct. The 1971 version is a moral fantasy with surreal edges. The 2005 version is a psychological fantasy with dark undertones. The 2023 version is an origin myth about creativity under pressure. From a thematic perspective, the 2023 Wonka is the most optimistic of the three. It frames creativity not as eccentricity or trauma response, but as a choice, something actively protected and developed through relationships and persistence. Another major critical discussion point is the film's musical identity. Unlike traditional musicals where songs dominate emotional pacing, Wonka integrates music more gently into storytelling. Some critics appreciated this restraint, arguing that it makes the musical moments feel more natural and less forced. Others felt the songs were not as memorable or bold compared to classic musical films. Still, the musical approach aligns with the film's broader philosophy, subtle wonder rather than overwhelming spectacle. Audience reactions also highlight a generational divide. Older viewers who grew up with earlier adaptations tend to compare the film against Wilder's version, often prioritizing eccentricity and unpredictability. Younger audiences, especially those familiar with Chalamet's work, tend to respond more to emotional accessibility and visual softness. This creates two parallel readings of the same film, one nostalgic, one emotional. Another interesting aspect of audience interpretation is how differently people read the film's capitalism metaphor. Some viewers see it as a light critique of corporate control over creativity, while others interpret it more broadly as a story about artistic independence in any system, whether business, school, or society. The chocolate cartel becomes a flexible symbol rather than a strict political allegory. In comparison to earlier adaptations, the 2023 film is the least cynical, where earlier versions often implied that Wonka is strange because the word is strange, or even cruel. This version suggests something softer. Wonka is strange because he refuses to stop imagining better possibilities. One of the most important shifts in this version is emotional accessibility. The film is designed so that audiences always understand Wonka's feelings. In Wilder's version, Wonka is mysterious. In Burton's version, he is emotionally guarded. In King's version, he is openly expressive. This reflects a broader trend in modern filmmaking. Clarity over ambiguity, especially in family oriented narratives. Critically, this choice is both praised and questioned. It makes the film more universally accessible but slightly reduces interpretive depth. However, its emotional consistency is also what gives it charm. It does not try to confuse the audience, it tries to comfort them. Ultimately, Wonka 2023 exists as a reinterpretation rather than a reinvention. It does not aim to replace earlier versions but to expand the mythology backward, asking a simple question: what kind of person would grow into the Willy Wonka we already know? And its answer is very different from previous films. Not a genius shaped by trauma, not a mysterious outsider, but a persistent dreamer who refuses to let systems define imagination. Across all versions, Willy Wonka remains a symbol. But the meaning of that symbol changes with each era. Unpredictability in 1971, psychological fragmentation in 2005, and hopeful creativity in 2023. By the time Wonka reaches its broader meaning in film culture, it becomes clear that this isn't just a standalone musical fantasy. It is part of a larger Hollywood pattern, taking familiar characters and rebuilding them as origin stories that are designed to feel emotionally safe, visually rich, and globally accessible. The film is less about reinventing Willy Wonka and more about reintroducing him to a generation that consumes stories differently than audiences did decades ago. At its core, the final conclusion of Wonka rests on a simple idea. Imagination is not just talent, it is persistence. The film frames Willy Wonka not as someone born extraordinary, but as someone who chooses to remain extraordinary in a world that constantly pressures him to become ordinary. This is why the story ends not with full success but with foundation building. The factory is not yet the legendary place audiences know, it is still an idea taking shape. And that matters because the message is that greatness is constructed, not discovered. From a legacy standpoint. Wonka positions itself carefully within the long history of Roald Dahl adaptations. It does not attempt to override previous interpretations, nor does it directly challenge them. Instead, it fills a narrative gap that did not technically need to exist but emotionally feels satisfying: the origin of belief. It answers a question nobody strictly needed answered. But many were curious about: how does someone like Willy Wonka become Willy Wonka? This is where the film's legacy becomes interesting. It may not be remembered as the most complex or groundbreaking adaptation, but it is likely to be remembered as the most emotionally accessible one. It turns a previously mysterious character into a relatable emotional journey, which means its long term impact will depend on how future audiences value clarity versus mystery. In terms of cultural footprint, Wonka benefits heavily from its timing. It arrives in an era where audiences are already familiar with cinematic universes, prequels, and reboots. Instead of fighting that trend, it embraces it fully. but with a softer tone. Unlike darker origin stories that focus on trauma or corruption, this film focuses on hope and creative survival. That makes it stand out within a landscape often dominated by high stakes conflict and franchise escalation. The film also strengthens Timothée Chalamet's position as a leading actor capable of carrying large scale franchise storytelling while maintaining emotional subtlety. His version of Wonka becomes less about transformation into a known figure and more about emotional continuity, showing how personality evolves rather than dramatically shifts. Looking at sequel potential, Wonka is in an unusual position. On one hand, the film intentionally builds toward the idea of a factory that is not yet fully realized, which leaves natural space for continuation. The relationships, especially with Noodle and the supporting cast, are not completely closed in a traditional sense. This allows room for further storytelling without needing to reset the emotional core. On the other hand, the film also functions as a soft origin conclusion. It explains enough to connect to the legendary Willy Wonka archetype while still preserving mystery. A direct sequel would have to carefully balance expansion without undermining the simplicity of the original narrative. If continued, it would likely explore the rise of the factory itself, the formation of its rules, and possibly the introduction of more eccentric elements that define later versions of the character. However, the bigger question is whether the story even needs a sequel. Part of the charm of Wonka lies in its completeness as an emotional arc, arrival, struggle, resistance, and formation of identity. Extending it further risks shifting it from a self contained fairy tale into a standard franchise structure. This leads into how the film fits into modern Hollywood storytelling. Over the last decade, studios have increasingly relied on prequels and origin stories as a way to extend existing intellectual properties. Wonka fits squarely into this trend, but with one key difference: it prioritizes tone over mythology expansion. Instead of building a complex shared universe, it builds a mood universe. Everything in the film is designed to feel consistent emotionally, warm, whimsical, slightly surreal, and deeply hopeful. This is what separates it from more traditional franchise expansions that focus heavily on continuity, lore, and interconnected plot lines. In that sense, Wonka reflects a shift in audience demand. Modern viewers, especially streaming era audiences, often engage with stories in fragmented ways: clips, songs, memes, and aesthetic moments rather than strictly linear narrative memory. Wonka unintentionally fits this consumption style very well. Its musical numbers, visual color palette, and comedic performances are easily extractable into standalone moments that circulate online independently of the full story. This is also why its meme culture became so strong. The film is not just watched, it is shared in pieces. Hugh Grant's Oompa Loompa, colorful chocolate sequences, and expressive musical scenes all function as viral fragments that extend the life of the film far beyond its theatrical context. From a storytelling evolution perspective, Wonka shows how Hollywood is increasingly blending three things: nostalgia, emotional simplicity, and franchise familiarity. It takes a well known character, removes much of the original mystery, and rebuilds him in a way that is easier to emotionally connect with for modern audiences. Critically, this raises a long term question for cinema. Does making characters more emotionally accessible reduce their mythic power, or does it simply evolve how myth works in modern storytelling? Wonka leans toward the second idea. It suggests that myths do not disappear, they adapt into more human shapes. In conclusion, Wonka is less about chocolate and more about emotional permission. It gives audiences permission to believe in imagination without irony, to see creativity as something worth protecting, and to accept that even legendary figures start from uncertainty. It may not be the darkest, most complex, or most faithful adaptation of Roald Dahl stone, but it is one of the most openly hopeful. And in today's cinematic landscape, that makes it stand out in a very specific way. Not as a reinvention of Willy Wonka, but as a reminder of why he mattered in the first place. There are some stories that don't begin with magic, they begin with resistance. With a world that quietly tells you no before you even finish your first idea. Wonka 2023 is one of those stories, but it disguises itself so beautifully that you almost miss how sharp its message really is. On the surface, it looks like a colorful musical about chocolate, imagination, and childhood wonder. But underneath that sugar coated surface, it is a story about systems, control, and what happens when one person refuses to accept that creativity must be approved before it is allowed to exist. Before Willy Wonka ever appears, the film introduces a city that feels polished, controlled, and emotionally distant. It is not a fantasy world in the traditional sense. It is more like a version of reality where everything has already been organized by people who decided that imagination needs supervision. Chocolate in this world is not just food or joy. It is a controlled industry, protected by powerful chocolatiers who treat creativity like property. If you are not part of their system, you are not allowed to participate in the idea of chocolate itself. That concept alone sets the tone for everything that follows, because it turns something playful into something political without ever saying it directly. Into this controlled environment arrives Willy Wonka, carrying nothing but a small suitcase and an almost unrealistic level of belief in his own imagination. He does not enter the city like someone preparing for rejection. He enters like someone who assumes the world still rewards originality. His confidence is not loud or aggressive. It is gentle, almost innocent, like he has not yet learned the full language of disappointment. And that is exactly what makes him vulnerable. He believes chocolate can change people, not just entertain them. He believes joy is enough to succeed, and for a brief moment, it almost seems like he might be right. The chocolate he creates is not ordinary, it behaves differently, it reacts emotionally. It feels alive in a way that does not fit into the rules of the industry around him. In another world, this would be the beginning of instant success. People would recognize genius immediately. But in this world, genius without permission is treated as disruption, and disruption is treated as threat. What makes Wonka's early journey so important is that his failure is not sudden or dramatic, it is systematic. He is not defeated by one person or one mistake. He is slowly pushed out by a structure that does not know how to process him. The chocolatiers do not need to destroy him physically. They only need to ensure that he cannot participate. His ideas are not argued against. They are ignored, delayed, and financially suffocated. This is where the film quietly shifts from fantasy into something more grounded and uncomfortable. It begins to show how systems don't always crush creativity loudly. Sometimes they just refuse to acknowledge it until it disappears. Wonka's optimism, however, does not break easily. Instead of retreating, he doubles down on the only thing he fully trusts, his imagination. He continues creating chocolate not as a business strategy but as a form of communication with a world that does not seem to understand him yet. In his mind, if people just taste what he creates, they will understand. But what he does not yet understand is that systems do not respond to understanding, they respond to control. This is where the emotional foundation of the film begins to form. Wonka is not just a dreamer. He is someone learning painfully and slowly that talent alone is not a currency in a world built on gatekeeping. And yet, even as he starts to lose stability, he does not lose belief. That is what makes him different from the world around him. The system demands practicality. Wonka insists on imagination, and that conflict becomes the emotional engine of everything that follows. The city itself almost feels like a character watching him fail. It does not hate him, it simply does not recognize him. That is a more subtle and more realistic form of resistance than open conflict, because being ignored can be more dangerous than being attacked. It removes the possibility of validation entirely, and still, Wonka continues. Because at this stage of his life, he has not yet learned the most painful lesson of all, that imagination is not rejected because it is bad, but because it is uncontrollable. That is where his real journey begins. The moment Willy Wonka realizes that talent is not enough to survive in this city, the story quietly changes its shape. It stops being about arrival and starts becoming about resistance. Because now, every step forward is not just progress. It is negotiation with a system that was never designed to include him in the first place. After his early attempts to introduce his chocolate to the world collapse under the weight of industry control, Wonka is no longer simply an outsider with ideas. He becomes a problem. Not because he has done something wrong, but because he has done something unregulated. In a world where chocolate is controlled by powerful cartels, creativity is not judged quality, it is judged by permission, and Wonka has none. This is where the film begins to reveal its real conflict. Not man versus man, but imagination versus structure. The established chocolatiers do not fear Wonka because he is dangerous in the traditional sense. They fear him because he cannot be easily categorized. His chocolate does not behave like a product, it behaves like an experience. and experiences that cannot be controlled are treated as threats to stability. As pressure builds, Wonka finds himself pushed into a situation he does not fully understand at first. He is manipulated into debt and contractual obligations that strip away his freedom to operate independently. This is not done with violence or dramatic confrontation, it is done through paperwork, confusion, and systems he has no experience navigating. And this is one of the film's most grounded ideas. The most powerful forces in society are not always loud or violent, sometimes they are administrative. This is how Wonka ends up trapped inside the laundry system run by a powerful and calculating woman who represents industrial control in its most normalized form. On the surface, the laundry operation is just another business. But underneath it, it is a machine designed for efficiency, conformity, and silence. Everything that passes through it is cleaned, processed, and standardized. Individuality is not encouraged, it is erased. For Wonka, this environment feels almost physically suffocating. It is the opposite of everything he believes in. Where he creates variation, the system enforces repetition. Where he sees possibility, the system sees risk. And where he expresses imagination, the system demands uniformity. The contrast is not just thematic, it is psychological. Wonka is a person who thinks in color, trapped inside a world that only understands grayscale. Inside this controlled environment, he meets Noodle, a young orphan who has already adapted to the system in ways Wonka has not. She is cautious, observant, and emotionally guarded. Unlike Wonka, she does not believe that the world rewards optimism. She believes it rewards survival. This difference becomes one of the most important emotional dynamics in the film. Their relationship does not begin with trust, it begins with hesitation. Noodle does not see Wonka as a hero, she sees him as unpredictable. Someone who still believes in outcomes the world has already disproven, and Wonka in turn does not immediately understand how deeply she has learned to expect disappointment. Their conversations carry an unspoken tension, not hostility, but difference in worldview. What makes their bond meaningful is that neither of them tries to fully convert the other. Instead, they slowly adjust. Wonka begins to understand that imagination without awareness can be dangerous in a structured system. Noodle begins to see that survival without imagination can slowly erase identity. Together, they form a fragile balance between hope and realism. While Wonka is physically trapped in the laundry system, he does not abandon his identity. Instead, he begins to create in secret. This is where the film introduces one of its strongest symbolic ideas imagination as resistance. Even when the system restricts him, Wonka continues experimenting with chocolate not as a product but as a form of expression that cannot be fully suppressed. Each hidden creation becomes an act of defiance, not loud or destructive but persistent. The idea is simple but powerful. Creativity does not disappear under pressure, it adapts, it hides. It survives in smaller, quieter forms until it can exist openly again. At the same time, the film deepens its portrayal of the chocolate cartel. They are not portrayed as cartoon villains, they are structured, strategic, and deeply invested in maintaining control. Their fear of Wonka is not emotional, it is economic. He represents unpredictability in a system built on predictability, and in such systems, unpredictability is more dangerous than failure. As the pressure increases, Wonka and Noodle begin forming a subtle alliance with others who have also been trapped within the system. These characters are not defined by heroism but by exhaustion. They are people who have learned to function inside limitations but have not completely lost the memory of possibility. This collective slowly becomes the foundation of resistance. Wonka's transformation during this phase is not dramatic. It is gradual and psychological. He begins to understand that imagination alone is not enough. It must be paired with strategy. Creativity must learn how to navigate systems, not just exist outside them. This realization marks the beginning of his evolution from isolated dreamer to coordinated thinker. And yet, despite all the pressure, he does not lose his core belief. He still thinks the world can be changed not through destruction, but through creation that people cannot ignore. That belief, fragile as it is, becomes the thread that holds everything together as the conflict moves toward its next phase. Because now, the system is not just ignoring him anymore, it is preparing to erase him. As the pressure tightens around Willy Wonka, the story stops being about survival inside the system and starts becoming about something far more dangerous to those in control exposure. Because once Wonka understands that the world he is trapped in is not just unfair but deliberately structured to suppress outsiders, his imagination begins to change direction. It is no longer only about creating wonder, it becomes about revealing truth. This shift does not happen in a single moment. It builds gradually as Wonka and Noodle begin to understand how deeply the chocolate industry is controlled by invisible agreements, financial manipulation, and reputation warfare. The cartel does not simply compete, it engineers outcomes. Success is distributed, not earned, and anyone outside their structure is not just excluded but actively discouraged from existing. Wonka's response to this realization is not anger in the traditional sense. It is clarity, and that clarity changes how he uses his inventions. His chocolate, which once existed purely as expression, begins to take on a second purpose. It still carries wonder, but now it also carries revelation. Each creation becomes a small disruption in a system built on control. This is where the film's central idea fully emerges imagination as a form of resistance. Wonka's chocolate is no longer just something people consume, it becomes something that interacts with perception, emotion, and truth. It exposes what the system tries to hide, not through destruction but through experience. People do not just see his creations, they react to them in ways that cannot be fully controlled or predicted. The chocolate cartel quickly realized that ignoring Wonka is no longer an option. At first, they tried to dismiss him as irrelevant. Now, they understand that his presence is destabilizing their authority, and so their strategy shifts. Instead of silent suppression, they move toward active containment. Reputation attacks begin to circulate, his credibility is questioned. His products are framed as unreliable or dangerous. The goal is no longer to compete with him but to isolate him from public trust entirely. This escalation pushes Wonka further into alignment with Noodle and the small group of individuals who have also been affected by the system. But even here, the film avoids turning them into a traditional rebellion group. They are not revolutionaries in the loud cinematic sense. They are people learning how to coordinate under pressure, discovering that survival itself can become organized resistance when imagination is shared instead of owned. Noodle's role becomes increasingly important during this phase. She is no longer just an observer or companion. She begins to understand the structure of the system in ways Wonka does not. Where Wonka thinks in invention, Noodle thinks in patterns. She recognizes how control is maintained not only through power but through predictability, and she begins to help Wonka navigate that predictability in reverse, using it against itself. Together, they began designing a series of public demonstrations disguised as simple chocolate showcases. But these are not ordinary presentations, each one is carefully constructed to expose something hidden within the system. A flaw in distribution, a corruption in authority, a truth that the cartel has buried beneath layers of branding and control. What makes these sequences powerful is that they do not rely on confrontation, they rely on perception. The audience inside the film experiences them as entertainment at first, but slowly realizes they are witnessing something more destabilizing. Wonka's creations begin to reveal contradictions in the world around them. Things that were assumed to be normal start to look suspicious, and once that shift begins in perception, it cannot easily be reversed. The cartel's reaction grows more desperate. They attempt to tighten control through public messaging and fear based narratives. They frame Wonka not as a visionary but as an unpredictable disruptor whose ideas could threaten stability. This is where the film subtly mirrors real world systems, showing how institutions often respond to disruption not by addressing it but by redefining it as danger. But Wonka is no longer operating as an isolated creator. His imagination has evolved into coordination. He is no longer just building things, he is building moments that cannot be easily controlled once released. And that is what makes him dangerous to the system. Not because he is attacking it directly, but because he is changing how people perceive it. As these tensions escalate, the emotional core of the film remains grounded in Wonka and Noodle's evolving trust. Their partnership becomes the emotional anchor of the resistance. Wonka brings vision, Noodle brings structure, and together they begin to form something neither of them had alone direction. Yet, even in this growing momentum, the film never frames their progress as guaranteed. There is always instability beneath it. The system they are challenging is larger, older, and more deeply embedded than any single act of resistance can immediately undo. And that uncertainty keeps the story from becoming simple triumph. What begins to emerge is not a revolution in the traditional sense, but a shift in possibility. People who once accepted the system without question start to hesitate. They start to notice inconsistencies. They start to wonder if the rules they live under are truly fixed or simply maintained. And that hesitation is where every system begins to weaken. Because once people start imagining alternatives, control is no longer absolute. And Wonka, whether he realizes it fully or not, has already started that process. As Wonka's influence grows, the city begins to change in a way that is not immediately visible but deeply felt. It is no longer just about a chocolatier causing disruption in a controlled market. It becomes something more subtle and more dangerous to those in power, a shift in belief. Because once people start questioning the structure they live under, even slightly, that structure is no longer absolute. The chocolate cartel senses this before they fully understand it. Their power has never depended only on resources or production. It depends on trust. People must believe that the system is stable, that the rules are necessary, and that nothing outside of it can succeed. Wonka's presence begins to erode that belief, not by attacking the system directly, but by creating moments that cannot be easily explained within it. Public demonstrations of his chocolate inventions began to take on a larger significance. What once looked like entertainment now feels like exposure. People who experience his creations start to see inconsistencies in the world around them. Not because Wonka tells them what to think, but because his inventions force them to experience something the system cannot fully regulate. Emotion becomes evidence, wonder becomes disruption. At this point in the story, Wonka himself begins to shift psychologically. He is still kind, still imaginative, but something more deliberate starts forming beneath his optimism. He is no longer reacting to the world, he is beginning to understand how to move within it. This is the early shape of the Willy Wonka myth that audiences already know from later timelines. The eccentricity remains, but now it is paired with awareness. Noodle continues to evolve alongside him, but her transformation is different. While Wonka becomes more confident in expression, Noodle becomes more confident in structure. She learns how systems operate from the inside out. Where Wonka sees possibility, she sees patterns. Where he sees invention, she sees consequence. Together, they begin to form a complete understanding of both imagination and reality, which makes their partnership increasingly effective. The chocolate cartel's response escalates further, moving from reputation control to direct interference. Their strategy is no longer subtle. They begin actively disrupting Wonka's supply chains, sabotaging his materials, and attempting to isolate him from any form of production. But even these efforts began to fail in a strange way because Wonka is no longer dependent on traditional systems of production. His creativity has already adapted beyond them. One of the most important undercurrents in this section of the film is how control begins to fracture not through destruction but through unpredictability. The cartel is strong when outcomes are predictable. Wonka weakens that predictability. Every new creation introduces a variable the system cannot fully anticipate. And in systems built on control, unpredictability is more destabilizing than direct conflict. This is also where the Oompa Loompa character introduced earlier in the narrative begins to take on deeper symbolic meaning. He is no longer just a quirky presence or comedic contrast. He becomes a reminder that Wonka's world is not isolated. There are histories, cultures, and consequences behind every act of creation. His cynical tone contrasts sharply with Wonka's optimism, but over time, that contrast becomes balance rather than opposition. He represents lived experience. The understanding that imagination alone is not enough without awareness of reality's cost. As tensions rise, Wonka's public identity begins to form more clearly in the eyes of the city. He is no longer just an outsider chocolatier. He becomes a symbol, though not one he fully controls. To some, he represents hope. To others, disruption. To the system, he represents instability that must be managed. And this transformation is crucial because it marks the moment where Wonka stops being a private individual and starts becoming a public idea. That shift changes everything about the conflict. Because you cannot easily remove an idea once it spreads, the cartel attempts one final strategy: controlling perception at scale. They try to frame Wonka not as a creator of wonder but as a threat to order. But by this point, the public has already experienced his work directly, and once people have experienced something that feels more truthful than the system around them, narratives become less effective. This is where the emotional core of the film reaches its turning point. Wonka is no longer trying to convince the world that imagination is valuable, he is showing it, and that difference is what begins to tip the balance. Noodle plays a critical role in this stage of escalation. She helps translate Wonka's chaotic creativity into structured actions that can operate within real world limitations. She understands timing, exposure, and coordination in ways Wonka does not naturally prioritize. Their partnership becomes less about inspiration and more about execution, which is why it begins to succeed. But even as their influence grows, the film avoids presenting this as a clean victory. The system is still intact, the cartel still has power. What is changing is not the structure itself but the confidence people have in it, and that shift is fragile. It can grow, but it can also be reversed if pressure collapses the momentum. The deeper meaning of this section of the story is that transformation does not happen through single moments of triumph, it happens through accumulated doubt. Each invention, each exposure, each small disruption builds towards a larger realization. The world is not as fixed as it appears, and once that realization spreads far enough, even the strongest systems begin to feel unstable. Wonka does not realize it yet, but he has already crossed a point of no return. He is no longer operating inside the system, he is rewriting how it is perceived. As the conflict reaches its final stage, the city no longer feels like a stable structure holding itself together. It feels like something under pressure, still standing but no longer unquestioned. Willy Wonka is no longer a quiet outsider trying to share chocolate. He has become a destabilizing force in a system that was never designed to absorb someone like him. And now the system responds the only way it knows how when control begins to slip. It tries to tighten everything at once. The chocolate cartel shifts into full containment mode. Their earlier strategies, dismissal, sabotage, reputation damage are no longer enough. Wonka's influence has already spread too widely through public experience. People have seen his inventions, felt their effects, and started questioning the assumptions they were taught about what is normal in the chocolate industry. So now the cartel's focus becomes direct suppression of access, visibility, and distribution. But what they fail to understand is that Wonka is no longer operating through traditional distribution systems. His creations are no longer just products moving through a controlled market. They have become events, shared experiences that live in memory, conversation, and perception. And once something becomes experiential rather than transactional, it becomes much harder to contain. This is where Wonka himself begins to fully transform into the figure audiences recognize in later mythology. Not through a sudden personality shift, but through refinement. His imagination becomes more intentional, his ideas become more structured, and most importantly, his understanding of people deepens. He begins to realize that creativity alone is not enough to change a system. Creativity must connect emotionally with those inside it. Noodle's role becomes even more central during this phase. Her backstory, once hinted at through survival and observation, begins to take clearer shape emotionally. She is not just someone who adapted to hardship, she is someone who learned to navigate systems that were never designed to protect her. This gives her a different kind of intelligence from Wonka. Where he sees possibility, she sees consequence. Where he builds ideas, she anticipates reactions. Together, they become a dual structure of imagination and grounding. This balance is what allows their final strategy to take form. Instead of direct confrontation, they aim to expose the system at its core weakness dependence on perception. The cartel does not maintain power through force alone, it maintains it through belief. People must believe that the cartel is necessary for order to exist. So the goal becomes simple in theory but complex in execution. Break the illusion of necessity. Wonka's inventions, once playful and expressive, now become carefully designed tools of revelation. Each one is structured not just to impress, but to reveal contradiction. A product that behaves differently than advertised. A public demonstration that exposes inconsistency in the cartel's messaging. A moment where controlled narrative breaks under lived experience. These are not attacks, they are exposures. And exposures are far more destabilizing than destruction because they cannot be easily dismissed once witnessed. As these events unfold, public perception begins to fracture more visibly. Some people cling to the established system because it represents stability. Others begin to lean toward Wonka's vision because it represents possibility. This division is not just political or economic, it is psychological. It reflects a deeper conflict between safety and imagination. The cartel responds by attempting one final consolidation of control. They try to reassert authority through fear, messaging, and structured narrative. But by this point, their language no longer carries the same weight it once did. People who have directly experienced Wonka's creations begin to trust experience more than instruction. That shift is irreversible in the short term. At the emotional center of this escalation is Wonka's evolving identity. He is no longer simply reacting to rejection or inequality. He is actively shaping how people interpret their world. But what makes his journey compelling is that he never loses his emotional core. He does not become cynical or detached. Instead, he becomes more precise. His optimism does not disappear, it matures. Noodle's arc also reaches a turning point here. Her understanding of the system deepens to the point where she recognizes not only how it operates but how it maintains emotional control over people. She sees how fear of instability keeps people compliant, and in recognizing that, she becomes instrumental in helping Wonka design strategies that do not rely on force, but on perception shifts that cannot easily be reversed. The final confrontation begins to form not as a battle in the traditional sense, but as a clash of narratives. On one side, the cartel attempts to preserve a controlled version of reality. On the other side, Wonka introduces experiences that cannot be fully contained within that version. The question is no longer who is stronger, it is which version of reality people will continue to believe. And belief, as the film repeatedly suggests, is the most powerful force in the system. By this point, Wonka is no longer just building chocolate. He is building a new framework of understanding. One where imagination is not treated as disruption but as a valid form of perception, and once that idea takes hold, the system that once controlled everything begins to realize something unsettling. It was never as permanent as it believed. As the final stretch of the story unfolds, Wonka stops feeling like a struggle against a visible enemy and starts feeling like a shift in reality itself. The chocolate cartel is still present, still powerful on paper, still holding on to the structure they built, but the foundation underneath that structure is no longer stable. Not because it has been physically destroyed, but because belief has started to drift away from it. And in a system like this, belief is everything. Willy Wonka, now fully shaped by everything he has endured, is no longer operating as someone trying to prove himself. He has moved past the need for approval. What drives him now is something quieter, but far more powerful: the need to ensure that imagination can exist without permission. His creations are no longer experiments or emotional expressions alone. They have become frameworks, carefully designed experiences that allow people to see beyond the limits they were taught to accept. The final phase of confrontation does not happen as a traditional showdown. There is no single battle where one side physically defeats the other. Instead, what unfolds is a collapse of narrative control. The cartel attempts one last time to reassert dominance through messaging, authority, and structured fear. They try to remind the public what stability looks like under their system. But by now, stability no longer feels as unquestionable as it once did. Too many people have experienced something outside of it. Too many moments have not fit the story they were told, and once those cracks appear, they begin to spread in ways that cannot be fully predicted. Wonka's final actions are not about destruction, they are about completion. Each invention, each public moment, each shared experience reaches its intended emotional effect. People do not just watch or consume anymore, they reflect. They compare what they are seeing with what they have been told, and that gap between perception and instruction becomes impossible to ignore. This is where the film's central idea fully resolves. Imagination does not defeat systems through force but through accumulation. One experience alone means nothing. But many experiences layered together begin to reshape what people believe is possible. Noodle's emotional arc reaches its resolution in this phase as well. She is no longer defined by survival or adaptation. She becomes someone who understands her own agency within the system, not just her response to it. Her journey is not about being saved or transformed by Wonka, it is about recognizing that she was never without influence, even when she felt invisible. That realization completes her character in a way that mirrors Wonka's own evolution, but from the opposite direction. He moves from imagination towards structure, she moves from structure toward possibility. Their partnership, which began as cautious alignment, becomes something closer to mutual understanding. Not dependency, not hierarchy, but balance. Each of them now represents a half of the same idea. Imagination needs grounding, and reality needs imagination, or neither can evolve. The chocolate cartel, in contrast, cannot evolve. And that is what ultimately leads to their collapse. Their system was built on control, predictability, and the assumption that people would continue to accept the framework they provided. But once that assumption weakens, there is nothing flexible enough within their structure to compensate. They cannot adapt to belief shifting away from them. So, what remains is not a dramatic destruction but a quiet dissolution of authority. Influence fades, control becomes less effective, and the city begins to operate on something new, not a fully formed alternative system, but an opening where imagination is no longer automatically treated as threat. In the aftermath, Willy Wonka is no longer an outsider trying to survive inside a rigid world. He has become something closer to a symbol that people interpret in different ways. To some, he represents creativity without permission. To others, he represents disruption of order. But to those closest to the experience, he represents something simpler and more powerful, the idea that imagination can exist in real space, not just in theory. This is where the myth begins to form, not the fully realized chocolate factory yet, not the eccentric legend from later stories, but the foundation of that idea. The belief that such a place should exist at all. The Oompa Loompas' presence in the broader narrative also settles into meaning here. He is no longer just an observer or contrast. He becomes a reminder that every world built on imagination still carries history, consequence, and voices that exist outside the central narrative. His perspective adds weight to Wonka's journey, preventing it from becoming purely romanticized. Imagination is powerful, but it is never without complexity, and that complexity is what makes the ending feel grounded despite its magical tone. Because Wonka does not end with a perfect victory, it ends with a transition. The system has not been erased, but it is no longer absolute, and that difference is everything. Willy Wonka stands at the threshold of what will eventually become his factory, not as someone who has conquered the world, but as someone who has changed how the world understands possibility. The chocolate is no longer just invention, it is language, it is emotion, it is a way of communicating ideas that cannot be fully contained by rules. And in that moment, the legend is no longer something in the future, it is already beginning, because Willy Wonka is not becoming someone new. He is becoming someone inevitable in the final layer of understanding Wonka 2023. The film begins to reveal something that is not immediately visible on the surface of its chocolate covered storytelling. It starts to look less like a simple origin story and more like a carefully shaped interpretation of what Roald Dahl's world has always represented beneath its whimsy. A place where imagination is powerful but never free from the pressure of systems that try to control it. From the perspective of director intent, Paul King approaches Wonka with a very specific emotional philosophy. Instead of treating Willy Wonka as an eccentric genius who already exists outside society, he reimagines him as someone who is still being formed by society. This shift is crucial. It changes the character from a mythic anomaly into a developing human being shaped by rejection, collaboration, and persistence. The intent is not to demystify Wonka but to humanize the moment before he becomes myth. This creative choice reflects a broader intention in modern storytelling. Audiences are no longer satisfied with mysterious icons who appear fully formed. They want to understand emotional origin, not just narrative origin. So the film deliberately focuses on Wonka as someone learning how systems work, how people respond to imagination, and how creativity survives under pressure rather than outside it. One of the strongest hidden symbolic threads in the film is chocolate itself, which operates on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, it is a product, a craft, and a business, but symbolically, it becomes a language of emotion that bypasses formal systems of communication. Chocolate in this world does not just taste different, it behaves differently, it reflects intention, feeling, and imagination in ways that structured industries cannot fully regulate. In symbolic terms, chocolate becomes a stand in for unregulated creativity, something that cannot be fully standardized without losing its meaning. The laundry system, by contrast, represents the opposite force emotional standardization. Everything is cleaned, processed, and flattened into uniform output. Where chocolate represents expressive chaos, laundry represents controlled repetition. This duality is not accidental, it forms the central symbolic tension of the film. Expression versus regulation, imagination versus systemization, individuality versus industrial order. Noodle's character adds another symbolic layer that is often overlooked. She represents lived experience within systems rather than opposition to them. She is not purely rebellious nor purely compliant. Instead, she exists in the adaptive space between survival and hope. In symbolic terms, she represents the human ability to navigate systems without fully belonging to them, which is why her partnership with Wonka is so important. Together, they form a complete emotional structure. One represents imagination without limits, the other represents awareness of limits without surrendering possibility. The chocolate cartel, meanwhile, symbolizes institutionalized control of creativity. Importantly, they are not portrayed as purely evil. This is a key thematic choice. They represent systems that believe stability requires restriction. In their worldview, imagination is not dangerous because it is malicious, but because it is unpredictable. This makes them symbolically closer to real world institutions that regulate industries, markets, and creative spaces under the belief that structure prevents collapse. This is where Roald Dahl's influence becomes more deeply embedded. Across Dahl's broader literary universe, there is a consistent tension between childlike imagination and oppressive adult systems. In Matilda, authority is cruel and irrational. In James and the Giant Peach, reality is harsh but escapable through imagination. In Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, wealth and morality are tested through surreal consequence. Wonka inherits all of these ideas but repositions them in a pre origin space, asking what kind of emotional environment produces someone like Willy Wonka in the first place. The Oompa Loompa mythology is another direct connection to Dahl's original work, but the film reinterprets it in a more self aware direction. Instead of functioning purely as moral commentators or factory workers, the Oompa Loompa presence in this version becomes a reflection of lived history and narrative awareness. It subtly acknowledges that every system of wonder has its own background, its own contradictions, and its own participants who are not simply decorative but essential to meaning. Symbolically, the Oompa Loompa also represents skepticism within imagination. Where Wonka embodies belief in possibility, the Oompa Loompa often introduces irony, memory, and consequence. This balance prevents the film from becoming purely idealistic. It reminds the audience that even in worlds built on wonder, there is always perspective shaped by experience. Another hidden layer lies in Wonka's relationship with failure. Each setback in the film is not framed as a narrative obstacle but as a structural lesson. Failure teaches Wonka how systems respond to unpredictability. It forces him to evolve from naive creation to strategic imagination. Symbolically, failure becomes the mechanism through which innocence transforms into awareness. This aligns with a recurring theme in Dahl's work, where characters are rarely rewarded for conformity but often shaped by their ability to persist through unfair systems. Even the city itself carries symbolic weight beyond its physical depiction. It is not just a setting, it is a representation of regulated imagination. Everything is visually rich but emotionally controlled. It is a place where creativity exists but only in approved forms. This makes Wonka's presence feel like an emotional disruption in a visually stable world. From a broader Roald Dahl universe perspective. Wonka functions almost like a mythological preface. It does not just explain how Willy Wonka becomes who he is, it retroactively reinterprets his later eccentricity as a response to structured resistance. His eventual unpredictability in later stories can be seen not as randomness but as learned behavior, a defense mechanism against systems that once tried to contain him. This is perhaps the deepest symbolic idea in the film that eccentricity is not always natural, it can be developed as resistance to normalization. When all these layers are combined, director intent, symbolic systems, and Dahl's thematic DNA, Wonka becomes something more complex than a prequel. It becomes a reinterpretation of imagination itself as something that must constantly negotiate with structure in order to survive. And that is why the film ultimately feels lighter on the surface but deeper underneath. It is not trying to reinvent Willy Wonka as a character. It is trying to explain why a character like Willy Wonka would need to exist in the first place. Because in the end, Wonka is not just about making chocolate. It is about making space for imagination in a world that is always trying to organize it, and that idea, more than anything else, is what connects it back to Roald Dahl's entire universe. The story of Wonka unfolds like a carefully staged illusion where every scene is designed not just to move the plot forward but to slowly reshape how we understand Willy Wonka himself. When you break it down scene by scene, you start to see something interesting. This isn't a straight line narrative. It's a gradual transformation of a dreamer being tested by a system that was never built for dreams. The film opens with a tonal contrast that sets everything in motion. We are introduced to a world that feels polished, structured, and slightly over controlled, like a city that has optimized joy into something measurable. The atmosphere is colorful but not chaotic, everything has boundaries. Even happiness feels like it has rules. This early environment quietly establishes the central tension of the film before Wonka even appears. Imagination exists here but only in approved forms. Then Willy Wonka arrives. His introduction is intentionally soft rather than dramatic. He does not enter like a conqueror or a genius revealing himself to the world. He arrives like someone who genuinely believes the world is still open to him. He carries his suitcase, his cocoa beans, and a confidence that feels almost innocent in nature. It is not arrogance, it is belief. And that belief immediately separates him from the world he enters. His first major attempt to engage with society is through his chocolate stall. This sequence is one of the most important emotional foundations of the film. Wonka presents his creations with genuine excitement, expecting curiosity, wonder, maybe even recognition. Instead, he is met with confusion, dismissal, and institutional resistance disguised as normality. People do not reject him loudly, they reject him casually, which is far more powerful. It is not hostility, it is indifference. This moment defines the emotional core of Wonka's journey. The shock of realizing that excellence is not automatically recognized in a controlled system. From here, the story shifts into escalation. Wonka's early success is immediately undermined by established chocolatiers who represent the industrial control of creativity. These figures are not portrayed as cartoon villains in this stage. They are calm, structured, and confident in their dominance. Their power does not come from aggression but from ownership. They control distribution, perception, and access. In their world, chocolate is not art, it is territory. Wonka's refusal to conform makes him a problem. This leads into his financial manipulation and entrapment sequence, one of the darker structural turns in the film. Without fully understanding the legal and economic systems around him, Wonka becomes trapped in debt and forced agreements that strip away his independence. This is not a dramatic betrayal moment, it is administrative collapse. Papers, signatures, misunderstandings, the system does not defeat him through force. It defeats him through complexity. This is the transition point where the film stops being about optimism and starts becoming about survival. Wonka is pushed into the laundry system, which becomes the next major narrative environment. This location is visually and emotionally the opposite of his imagination. It is repetitive, controlled, and emotionally flattened. Every action is measured, processed, and standardized. It represents what happens when creativity is forced into industrial repetition. Inside this system, Wonka meets Noodle. Their first test interactions are cautious and observational. Noodle does not trust him, and rightly so. She has adapted to a world where survival depends on emotional restraint. Wonka, in contrast, still operates on openness and curiosity. This creates a natural tension between them that slowly evolves into understanding. The laundry sequences also introduce the main antagonist structure more clearly. The laundromat owner and the chocolate cartel represent interconnected systems of control. One manages labor and order, the other manages imagination and consumption. Together, they form a complete ecosystem of suppression. Wonka's secret chocolate experiments begin during this phase. These scenes are quieter but emotionally important. He is no longer creating for attention, he is creating to stay alive internally. Even in confinement, imagination continues. This is one of the film's most consistent ideas. Creativity does not disappear under pressure, it adapts into hidden forms. As Wonka and Noodle begin to cooperate, the narrative shifts into planning and resistance. Their alliance is not instant or emotional, it is practical. Noodle helps him understand how systems operate. Wonka contributes invention and unpredictability. Together, they begin identifying cracks in the cartel's structure. The first major coordinated action against the system is not violent or direct, it is observational disruption. They begin testing how information, perception, and public experience can be influenced through controlled demonstrations. Wonka's chocolate inventions start functioning as experiential triggers rather than products. Each one reveals something about the system indirectly, forcing people to notice inconsistencies they previously ignored. One of the key mid film sequences involves a public demonstration of Wonka's chocolate creations. This scene is important because it marks the shift from hidden survival to visible influence. The audience within the film experience something that cannot be fully explained by the established system. It creates confusion, curiosity, and emotional disruption. This is the beginning of the cartel's loss of control over narrative. From here, the escalation becomes more psychological than physical. The cartel begins reputation attacks. They attempt to redefine Wonka publicly, framing him as unstable, unpredictable, and dangerous. But this strategy begins to weaken as more people experience his creations directly. Once personal experience contradicts official narrative, control begins to fracture. Noodle's backstory becomes more emotionally visible during this phase. Her understanding of systems is not theoretical, it is lived. She recognizes patterns of control because she has survived within them. This gives her a perspective Wonka does not initially have. While he sees possibility, she sees structure. While he sees imagination, she sees consequence. Their partnership becomes increasingly balanced as a result. One of the most important structural sequences in the film is the shift from individual creativity to coordinated disruption. Wonka stops acting alone and begins designing experiences that require participation, interpretation, and emotional engagement from others. These moments are not about spectacle, they are about awareness. Each invention functions like a question directed at the system rather than a product offered to it. As pressure increases, the cartel moves into full containment strategy. They attempt to restrict access, control messaging, and isolate Wonka entirely from influence. But by this point, their control is already weakened. The issue is no longer production, it is perception. People have seen too much outside the controlled narrative. The final phase of the story begins here, where the conflict is no longer about whether Wonka can succeed, but whether the system can maintain belief in itself. Wonka's identity starts to stabilize into something closer to the legendary figure audiences recognize from later timelines. His imagination becomes structured, his confidence more intentional, and his understanding of systems more precise. But importantly, he does not lose emotional openness. He becomes more aware without becoming cynical. Noodle's arc reaches emotional completion alongside his. She transitions from survival mode into agency. She is no longer defined by her environment but by her response to it. Her growth mirrors Wonka's but from the opposite direction. The final sequences of resistance are not about destruction of the system but collapse of its narrative authority. Once people stop fully believing in its necessity, its structure begins to weaken naturally. And that is how the film reaches its conclusion, not with victory in the traditional sense, but with transition. Wonka is no longer just a dreamer trying to survive in the world. He is now someone shaping how the world understands dreaming itself. And that is where the legend quietly begins. When you start digging into Wonka 2023 beyond the surface story, you quickly realize something important. This film was never designed just as a standalone musical fantasy. It was built like a layered reference machine where production choices, visual design, and even character behavior quietly connect back to Roald Dahl's legacy, earlier adaptations, and decades of chocolate fueled mythology. And what makes it more interesting is that many of these details are not loudly announced. They are hidden in textures, framing, costume choices, and narrative omissions. One of the most noticeable production decisions is the film's deliberate rejection of overly digital environments. Even though it is a fantasy heavy musical, a large portion of the world is built using physical sets, practical lighting, and tangible props. This was a conscious choice to preserve what director Paul King often describes as touchable imagination, a world that feels real enough to almost smell and taste. This production philosophy directly supports the film's central theme. Imagination should feel lived in, not synthetic. There is also a strong visual continuity effort with Roald Dahl's illustrated world. The color palette is not random, it leans heavily into warm browns, soft golds, and slightly exaggerated pastel tones that mirror the illustrated covers of Dahl's books. Even the lighting design often avoids harsh realism, instead, favoring a storybook glow that makes the city feel like it exists somewhere between memory and fantasy. One of the most subtle Easter eggs is embedded in Wonka's character design itself. His clothing evolves slightly throughout the film, starting with a more grounded traveler like outfit and gradually becoming more stylized and eccentric as his identity solidifies. This progression is not just aesthetic, it mirrors the transformation from unknown inventor to mythic figure. By the end, his silhouette begins to subtly resemble the iconic Wonka designs from earlier adaptations. Without directly copying them, another layer of hidden detail appears in the chocolate inventions. Many of them are structured like emotional metaphors rather than literal products. Some early concepts reportedly removed during development included even more experimental chocolate ideas that were considered too abstract for mainstream audiences. These included sequences where chocolate would react to memory or shift form based on emotional presence. While not fully realized in the final cut, traces of this idea remain in how the film treats chocolate as an emotional extension rather than a simple food item. The character of Noodle also underwent several development stages before reaching her final form. Early production notes reportedly framed her more as a passive companion figure, but during rewriting and production refinement, she evolved into a much more structurally important character. Her final role is closer to a co lead than a side character, which is why her intelligence and system awareness feel so integral to the plot. This change is crucial because it shifts the emotional balance of the story away from a single savior narrative and toward collaborative transformation. Hugh Grant's Oompa Loompa is another major production evolution that carries hidden meaning. In earlier conceptual stages, the character was designed in a more traditional, purely musical support role. But during development, the decision was made to give him a sharper, more self aware tone. This is why his final portrayal feels slightly ironic, almost meta commentary like. It reflects a modern reinterpretation of Dahl's original idea, where Oompa Loompas are not just whimsical workers but beings with their own history and perspective. There are also subtle references to earlier Charlie and the Chocolate Factory adaptations, but they are intentionally non direct. For example, Wonka's slightly theatrical presentation style during demonstrations echoes Gene Wilder's controlled eccentricity, while certain emotional isolation beats subtly reflect Johnny Depp's more psychologically fractured interpretation. However, the film avoids imitation. Instead, it blends these tonal echoes into a younger, still forming version of the character. One of the most interesting production decisions is the way antagonists are designed. Rather than creating a single central villain, the film distributes antagonism across systems, corporate chocolatiers, bureaucratic control, and industrial exploitation. This reflects a modern storytelling shift away from evil individuals and towards structured opposition. The chocolate cartel is not a person, it is a network, and that makes it harder to defeat in a traditional narrative sense, which is exactly the point. There are also small visual Easter eggs tied to Roald Dahl's broader literary universe. Certain architectural choices in the city subtly echo illustrations from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory editions, while specific background props, such as exaggerated candy displays and oddly scaled food items, reflect Dahl's recurring fascination with distorted consumption. Even the way crowds react to Wonka's inventions mirrors the unpredictable moral reactions in Dahl's original stories, where characters are often rewarded or punished based on curiosity rather than status. Deleted story concepts also reveal how the film could have taken a much darker direction. Early versions reportedly leaned more heavily into the idea of Wonka being actively hunted by the chocolate industry rather than gradually opposed. This would have made the narrative more thriller like with higher stakes but less whimsical tone. Ultimately, the creative direction shifted toward emotional warmth and musical storytelling instead of tension driven survival narrative. Another removed concept involved expanding the political structure of the city more explicitly, showing clearer governance systems behind the chocolate industry. This was ultimately simplified to keep the story emotionally focused rather than politically dense. Instead of explaining how the system works in detail, the film chooses to show its effects on individuals like Wonka and Noodle. The musical production itself also contains hidden storytelling logic. Songs are not placed randomly, they often appear at emotional transition points rather than exposition points. This creates a rhythm where music functions as emotional processing rather than narrative explanation. It is less about advancing plot and more about translating internal change into external expression. Even the pacing of the film reflects this philosophy. Moments of rapid invention and visual spectacle are followed by quieter grounding scenes, creating a push and pull structure that mirrors Wonka's internal emotional rhythm. Imagination followed by resistance, optimism followed by recalibration. Another subtle production detail lies in how space is used. Environments are often designed to feel slightly oversized or slightly compressed depending on Wonka's emotional state. This gives the film a subconscious visual language where physical space reflects psychological pressure or freedom. In terms of Roald Dahl legacy connections, perhaps the most important hidden thread is thematic rather than visual. The idea that children or childlike dreamers are constantly placed against rigid adult systems is central to almost all of Dahl's work. Wonka expands this idea backward in time, showing not just the confrontation itself, but the formation of the mindset that leads to it. Even the humor in the film carries Dahl like structure. It is often slightly uncomfortable, slightly exaggerated, and rooted in emotional imbalance rather than clean punchlines. This aligns with Dahl's tendency to mix whimsy with mild cruelty, creating humor that feels both playful and slightly unsettling. Ultimately, the Easter eggs, deleted ideas, and production choices all point toward a single creative intention: to build a version of Willy Wonka that feels inevitable rather than constructed. Not a character invented for this film, but a personality being slowly revealed through context, contradiction, and emotional accumulation. And that is why Wonka works not just as a prequel but as a reinterpretation layer over everything that came before it. Because every detail, visible or hidden, keeps pointing back to the same idea. Imagination is not a product, it is a system that refuses to stay controlled.